leather duty belt creaked against my hip as I adjusted the weight of my .45 pistol for what felt like the 100th time that evening. The familiar jangle of keys against my flashlight had become a comforting rhythm during my months at Fort Campbell. But tonight, something felt different. The diesel fumes from the MP station mixed with Tennessee's thick summer air, creating that distinctive military smell of oil, sweat, and determination that had become my second skin. I ran my fingers along the scratchy wool of my BDU uniform, checking each piece of gear with the methodical precision that 4 years in the Army had drilled into me. Radio clipped to my left shoulder, spare magazine in my cargo pocket, and that massive key ring that could unlock half the base. Everything in its place. Everything ready for another night patrol through Campbell's endless back roads. Jesus, how many keys are on that thing? Wireman asked, fumbling with the spotlight controls on our patrol truck. His city boy nervousness always showed when we drew the remote sector assignments. Enough to get us into every forgotten corner of this place, I replied, demonstrating the quick flip technique that separated the vehicle lock keys from the building access ones. Each sector has its own locks, and some of these buildings haven't been opened since Vietnam. The radio crackled with the usual evening chatter, patrol routes, checkpoint times, and the endless bureaucracy of peacetime military life. Budget cuts had left us with aging equipment and skeleton crews, but we were still expected to maintain the same level of security that had protected this base for decades. It was 1987, and we were soldiers trained for war, but assigned to guard empty buildings and rusted equipment. My old man used to tell stories about this place, I said, starting the truck's engine. He was stationed here briefly in '68 before shipping out to Southeast Asia. Said the locals always had strange tales about these woods. Wireman glanced at me nervously. What kind of tales? The kind that make you grateful for daylight patrols. But tonight wasn't daylight. Tonight was another journey into Fort Campbell's shadow world, where 165 square miles of mostly undeveloped wilderness stretched beyond our headlights. As we pulled away from the station, I caught a scent that didn't belong. Something wild and musky that seemed to cling to the humid air like a warning. The radio crackled again, this time with more static than usual. Unit 7, you're cleared for Sector 12 patrol. Report in every 30 minutes. Copy that, dispatch. I keyed the mic and looked at Wireman. Ready for another quiet night in paradise? He didn't answer, just stared ahead as we drove toward the perimeter roads. Neither of us knew the vehicle storage lot emerged from the darkness like a graveyard of forgotten wars. Moonlight filtered through heavy clouds, casting shifting shadows across rows of abandoned cars that had been sitting here since the early '70s. The 12-foot chain-link fence topped with barbed wire created stark geometric lines against the wilderness beyond. But it was what lay inside that fence that always made my skin crawl. There's something seriously wrong with this place, Wireman muttered, positioning the spotlight to sweep across the lot's perimeter. All those cars just sitting there, rotting away? Makes you wonder about the guys who own them. I knew the official story. Soldiers who deployed to Vietnam and never returned, either KIA or MIA. Their families never claiming the vehicles. But looking at those rust-covered hulks with their flat tires and crumbling interiors, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were disturbing something that should be left alone. Just another patrol, I said, more to convince myself than Wireman. Check the gates, rattle the locks, move on to the next sector. We'd done this routine dozens of times, but tonight felt different. The usual sounds of the Tennessee wilderness, crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of small animals, seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Hold up," Wireman suddenly said, his voice tight. "You see that?" I followed his gaze toward the center of the lot, where the oldest vehicles sat in neat rows like mechanical tombstones. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and moonlight playing tricks on rusted metal. Then something moved. It was fast, too fast for a person, and it seemed to flow between the cars with an agility that made my military training kick into high alert. Whatever it was, it didn't belong there, and it definitely wasn't supposed to be inside a secured perimeter. "Could be teenagers," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. This was something else entirely. Wireman was already reaching for his radio. "Should we call it in?" "Not yet. Let's investigate first." I pulled the truck to a stop near the main gate. Standard protocol. We check it out, identify the threat, then report. As I stepped out of the truck, keys jangling in the humid night air, I had no idea that standard protocol was about to become completely useless. The gate key felt slippery in my sweaty palm as I fumbled through the massive ring, trying to find the right one while keeping my flashlight trained on the darkness beyond the fence. Each failed attempt sent a small jolt of frustration through me, but underneath that frustration was something else, a growing sense that we were being watched. Come on," I muttered, trying what felt like the 20th key. The truck's headlights created a harsh circle of light behind me, turning everything beyond into impenetrable black. I could hear Wireman repositioning the spotlight, its beam sweeping across the lot in systematic patterns. Finally, the lock clicked open. I unwrapped the chain and began swinging the gate open, metal hinges protesting with a rusty screech that seemed to echo off the abandoned vehicles. The sound felt wrong in the heavy stillness of the night, like a dinner bell for whatever was hiding in those shadows. I took my first step through the gate, my boots crunching on gravel that hadn't been disturbed in months. The familiar weight of my pistol provided some comfort, but it felt inadequate against the vast darkness stretching before me. Behind me, I heard Wireman climbing back into the truck, preparing to drive through once I'd cleared the entrance. Then the scream erupted. It was a sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to something primal in my brain. Long, piercing, and absolutely inhuman. It rose from somewhere deep in the lot like the cry of a dying god. The sound seemed to strip away years of military training, leaving me frozen in place like a deer in headlights. My muscles locked up completely. The flashlight beam wavered as my hand began to shake, creating dancing shadows that made the entire lot seem to writhe and move. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as a cold chill ran down my spine despite the warm Tennessee night. This wasn't an animal. I'd grown up in these woods, heard every sound the local wildlife could make, but this was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in any world I understood. The scream died away, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the sound itself. In that silence, I became aware of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, the taste of copper in my mouth, and the way my vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused on the darkness ahead. Then, from different locations throughout the lot, more screams answered the first. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't dealing with a single intruder. There were multiple things spread throughout the lot, and they were communicating with each other. The screams had come from at least 4 different locations, maybe more, forming a rough circle around the entrance where I stood like a target in a shooting gallery. "David!" Wireman's voice cut through my paralysis. "Get back to the truck." His words snapped me back to tactical thinking. Multiple unknowns, coordinated behavior, superior knowledge of the terrain. Every aspect of this situation screamed ambush. We were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and completely unprepared for whatever we were facing. I started backing toward the truck, my hand instinctively moving to my holster. The weight of the .45 felt reassuring until I realized that standard military sidearms might be useless against threats that could make sounds like that. What were we supposed to do, shoot at shadows and screams? "You see them?" I called back to Wireman, my voice barely steady. "I see movement, but I can't get a clear visual. There's something out there, multiple somethings." The truck's headlights put us at a severe disadvantage. While they illuminated the immediate area around the gate, they also turned us into perfect targets for anything watching from the darkness beyond. We were silhouetted against the light, visible to creatures that seemed perfectly adapted to moving unseen through the shadows. I reached the truck and yanked open the passenger door, but I couldn't bring myself to get in. Military training demanded that we investigate, identify the threat, and report our findings, but every instinct I'd developed growing up in these Tennessee woods was screaming at me to run. "Should we call for backup?" Wireman asked, his city boy nervousness now replaced by something closer to panic. "And tell them what? That we're hearing scary noises in the dark?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but the truth was I had no idea what we were dealing with. "How do you report the impossible?" From somewhere in the lot came a new sound, not a scream this time, but something that might have been breathing. Deep, rhythmic, and far too large to come from any animal I knew. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. "We need to see what we're dealing with," I said, drawing my pistol. Standard protocols, but as I spoke those words, I knew that nothing about this situation was standard. The creature stood up from behind a rusted sedan with a fluidity that defied its massive size. One moment there was nothing but shadow and moonlight. The next, there was something that shouldn't exist, towering above the vehicles like a nightmare made flesh. "Jesus Christ!" Wireman whispered, his voice barely audible over the truck's idling engine. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The cars around it, vehicles that had seemed substantial in daylight, now looked like toys beside this thing. Its silhouette was wrong in every possible way. Too broad at the shoulders, too thick through the torso, moving with a predatory grace that made my blood run cold. For a moment, it just stood there as if studying us. Then it moved. The speed was impossible. Something that large shouldn't be able to move that fast, but it was already closing the distance between us with long, purposeful strides. It didn't run like a man or lumber like a bear. It moved with the fluid power of something built for pursuit. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, scrambling into the truck. Wireman floored the accelerator, tires spinning on gravel as we lurched forward. The truck's headlights swung wildly as we turned, briefly illuminating the creature's form. Dark brown hair covered its entire body, and its head was distinctly non-human, elongated, with a pronounced brow ridge that cast deep shadows over its eyes. We hit the road running parallel to the fence line, the truck's engine roaring as Wireman pushed it as hard as he dared on the narrow back road. I twisted in my seat to look back, expecting to see the creature falling behind, trapped on the other side of the fence. Instead, I saw it keeping pace with us. "It's still there," I said, hardly believing my own words. "It's running alongside us." The thing was maybe 10 feet away, separated only by the chain-link fence and a narrow strip of grass. Even at 30 miles per hour, it was matching our speed with what looked like minimal effort. Its legs pumped with mechanical precision, and I could hear its breathing, deep, rhythmic huffs that spoke of enormous lung capacity. I grabbed my flashlight and trained it on the creature, needing to see more clearly what we were dealing with. The beam caught it full in the face, and for a terrifying moment, our eyes met. They weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, and something that might have been anger. The creature's face was more human than I'd expected, with a distinct nose and mouth, but the proportions were all wrong. Its jaw was too wide, its brow too prominent. And when it opened its mouth, I caught a glimpse of teeth that belonged in a predator's skull. "It's looking at me," I said, my voice tight with fear. "It's not watching where it—" The creature seemed to understand that we were trying to escape, and it didn't like it. Its breathing grew louder, taking on a grunting quality that suggested either exertion or frustration. But it wasn't slowing down. "How fast are we going?" I asked. 35, maybe 40, Wireman replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The creature was keeping up with a vehicle traveling at highway speeds, running upright on two legs across uneven terrain. Everything I knew about biology, about what was possible in the natural world, said this couldn't be happening. But my eyes were telling me a different story. We were sharing the road with something that shouldn't exist, and it was winning. The chase continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The creature maintained its impossible pace, never falling back, never seeming to tire. Its heavy breathing had become a constant background noise, mixing with the truck's engine and the sound of our tires on asphalt. "There's got to be a break in the fence somewhere," Wireman said, his voice strained. "If it gets through." I didn't want to think about what would happen if that thing reached the road. The fence was the only thing between us and whatever primal intelligence was keeping pace with our truck. But fences could be climbed, and something that moved like this creature might not be stopped by 12 feet of chain link and barbed wire. The creature's stride never varied. It ran with its upper body held stiff, rocking slightly from side to side with each step. Its arms didn't swing like a human's would. They remained fixed at its sides, suggesting that all its forward momentum came from the power of its legs. The muscles in its thighs and calves were clearly defined, even through its coat of dark hair, bunched and releasing with each ground-covering step. I kept my flashlight trained on it, partly to track its movement, and partly because I couldn't look away. There was something hypnotic about watching this impossible thing in action. This creature that defied every law of nature I thought I understood. "It's getting closer to the fence," I said, noticing how the creature had angled its run to bring it nearer to the chain link. As if responding to my words, the creature suddenly veered toward the fence and launched itself upward. The jump was effortless, a fluid motion that carried it up and over the 12-foot barrier like it was stepping over a curb. For a moment, it was airborne, silhouetted against the night sky like something from a fever dream. Then it hit the barbed wire. The creature's forward momentum carried it into the coiled wire at the top of the fence, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it showed a reaction that seemed almost human. It thrashed and struggled, caught in the sharp metal coils, its movements becoming frantic rather than controlled. "It's stuck!" Wireman shouted, pressing harder on the accelerator. The creature crashed to the ground on our side of the fence, landing in a heap just yards from the road. It rolled and fought with something, the barbed wire, I realized, that it had pulled down with it during its fall. The metallic scraping sound of wire against pavement was audible even over the truck's engine. I watched through the rear window as the creature struggled to free itself from the tangle of wire and fence posts. Its movements were still powerful, but they had lost that fluid grace that had made it so terrifying. For the first time, it looked vulnerable. "Keep going," I said, though Wireman showed no signs of slowing down. "Don't stop." As we rounded a bend in the road, the creature disappeared from view. But I could still hear it, a sound like metal being torn apart, punctuated by what might have been grunts of pain or frustration. We drove in silence for several minutes, both of us trying to process what had just happened. The normal sounds of the Tennessee night gradually returned. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through leaves. But they all seemed different now, less innocent. "What the hell was that thing?" Wireman finally asked. I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure I wanted one. If you're questioning what's real and what's possible, remember that some truths are too strange for official reports.
The radio crackled to life just as we reached the next checkpoint, jarring both of us back to the reality of military protocol and required reports. The familiar voice of the night dispatcher cut through our shared silence like a blade. Unit 7, you're overdue for your Sector 12 report. What's your status? I stared at the radio handset, my fingers hovering over the transmit button. What was I supposed to tell them? That we'd encountered something impossible? That military personnel had been chased by a creature that shouldn't exist? That everything we thought we knew about the natural world had just been turned upside down? Unit 7, please respond, the dispatcher repeated, a note of concern creeping into his voice. Wireman looked at me, his eyes reflecting the same internal struggle I was feeling. We were trained soldiers, expected to report accurately and completely on everything we encountered during our patrols. But we were also career military, and we both knew what happened to soldiers who filed reports that made their superiors question their mental stability. The radio was acting up, I said quietly to Wireman. Lots of static, hard to hear transmissions clearly. He nodded, understanding immediately. In the military, equipment failures were common and acceptable. Personal failures, especially psychological ones, were career-ending. I keyed the mic. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Radio problems, that's why we're late reporting. Sector 12 shows all clear, no unusual activity. Copy that, Unit 7. Make sure to have that radio checked when you return to base. Will do, dispatch. Continuing patrol. As I hung up the handset, I realized I'd just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The official record would show that our patrol of the vehicle storage lot had been routine, uneventful. No mention of screams in the darkness. No report of impossible creatures. No documentation of the most significant event that had ever happened to me in 4 years of military service. We can't tell anyone, Wireman said, voicing what we both already knew. They'd have us in front of a psych evaluation board before morning. Or worse, I replied. With the budget cuts, they're looking for any excuse to reduce personnel. A couple of MPs claiming they saw monsters would be the perfect justification for early discharge. The truck felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of our shared secret was pressing in on us from all sides. We'd become conspirators in our own silence, bound together by an experience that neither of us could officially acknowledge. So, what do we do? Wireman asked. Just pretend it never happened? We finish our patrol, I said. We file a standard report. We get our radio fixed and continue with our assignments like professional soldiers.
But even as I spoke the words, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. We'd seen something that existed outside the boundaries of accepted reality, and now we had to live with that knowledge while pretending it didn't matter. The rest of the night passed in a blur of routine checkpoints and normal radio calls. We inspected fences, checked locks, and maintained the appearance of soldiers conducting standard security operations. But underneath the surface, we were both processing what we'd witnessed, trying to fit it into a worldview that had no place for creatures like the one we'd encountered. When dawn finally broke over Fort Campbell, we returned to the vehicle storage lot. The gate stood open, exactly as I'd left it when the nightmare began. In the morning light, the lot looked almost normal, just rows of abandoned vehicles and storage buildings, nothing threatening or mysterious about it. We need to secure that gate, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We drove through the entrance, both of us scanning the area for any sign of the previous night's events. The cars sat in their neat rows, unchanged. The buildings looked the same as always. If not for the barbed wire that had been pulled down from the fence, I might have been able to convince myself that we'd imagined the whole thing. But there it was. A 10-foot section of wire lying twisted on the ground, exactly where the creature had landed after its jump. Physical evidence that something had happened,
something that had torn through military-grade security measures like they were paper. "Equipment failure," wireman said, looking at the damaged wire. "Probably weakened by weather, finally gave way." "Right," I agreed. "We'll report it as routine maintenance required." I secured the gate with the same padlock I'd opened just hours before, but as I wrapped the chain around the posts, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't locking something out. We were locking something in. The official report would list damaged perimeter wire as the only notable event of our patrol. The truth would remain buried in the shared silence of two soldiers who'd learned that some realities were too dangerous to acknowledge. The weeks that followed our encounter blurred together in a haze of routine patrols and sleepless nights. Every evening brought the same dread as I strapped on my gear and prepared for another shift in Fort Campbell's remote sectors. The vehicle storage lot remained on our rotation, a constant reminder of what we'd witnessed and what we'd chosen to hide. I found myself requesting different patrol routes, volunteering for desk duty, anything to avoid returning to that place. But the military doesn't accommodate personal preferences, especially when you can't explain them without sounding insane. So night after night, I found myself driving those same back roads, checking those same gates, and trying to pretend that the shadows between the abandoned cars held nothing more threatening than memories. The worst part was the isolation. Wireman and I had developed an unspoken understanding. We wouldn't talk about what we'd seen, not even to each other. The experience had created a bond between us, but it was a bond forged in shared trauma and mutual silence. We were the only two people who knew the truth, and that made us accomplices in our own cover-up. I started having dreams about the creature, not nightmares exactly, but vivid, detailed dreams where I relived those moments of pursuit, feeling again the weight of its gaze and the sound of its breathing. I'd wake up with my heart racing, the taste of copper in my mouth, and the absolute certainty that something was watching me from the darkness outside my barracks window. The dreams began to affect my performance during daylight hours. I'd catch myself staring into the tree line during formations, scanning the shadows for movement that shouldn't be there. Other soldiers started to notice, making jokes about my 1,000-yard stare and asking if I was getting enough sleep. "You've been acting weird lately," my squad leader mentioned one afternoon. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," I replied, the lie coming easily now. "These night shifts are wearing me down." But it wasn't just fatigue. It was the constant awareness that Fort Campbell wasn't the secure military installation I'd thought it was. Somewhere in those 165 square miles of wilderness, things lived that had no place in any official manual or training program. The base's perimeter wasn't just protecting us from human threats. It was containing something that military planners had never considered. I started researching the area's history, spending my free time in the base library looking for any mention of unusual incidents or unexplained phenomena. What I found didn't comfort me. The Kentucky-Tennessee border region had a long history of strange encounters, dating back to Native American legends and continuing through modern times. The famous Kelly encounter in the 1950s had happened less than an hour's drive from where we'd had our experience. The more I learned, the more I realized that our encounter wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, an ongoing reality that existed parallel to official military operations. Other soldiers had probably seen similar things, but like us, they'd chosen silence over career suicide. "Do you think we should have reported it?" Wireman asked one night, breaking weeks of silence on the subject. We were conducting another routine patrol, driving past the very spot where the creature had run alongside our truck. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. "Would you have believed us?" I asked in return. He thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "Probably not." Then we made the right choice. But even as I said it, I wondered if we really had. Every night that passed without reporting what we'd seen was another night that other soldiers might encounter the same thing, unprepared. We'd chosen our careers over our duty to warn others, and that choice sat heavy on my conscience. The creature had shown us that the world contained realities beyond military training and official acknowledgement. Now we had to live with that knowledge while pretending it didn't exist.
30 years have passed since that night at Fort Campbell, and I still wake up sometimes with the sound of that creature's breathing in my ears. I've carried this story with me through decades of civilian life, through marriage and career changes, and all the normal milestones that mark a life lived in the official world. But the unofficial world, the world of shadows and impossibilities, has never quite let me go. I've followed the stories over the years, the reports of missing hikers in the Kentucky wilderness, the unexplained disappearances of campers who ventured too far into the remote areas around Fort Campbell. Each news story sends that familiar chill down my spine, the recognition that what we encountered that night wasn't just passing through the area, it was home. The internet has made it easier to find others who've had similar experiences, and I've discovered that our encounter wasn't as unique as I'd thought. Other military personnel, forest rangers, and local residents have all reported similar encounters in the region, but official acknowledgement remains as elusive now as it was in 1987. I understand why. The military operates on the principle of controlled variables and predictable outcomes. Supernatural threats can't be contained by standard protocols or defeated by conventional weapons. They represent a breakdown in the ordered world that military thinking requires, but they exist nonetheless. Wireman and I lost touch after we were both reassigned to different units. I've often wondered if he still thinks about that night, if he still questions whether we made the right choice in staying silent. I've thought about reaching out to him, but what would I say? That I've spent 30 years wondering about a creature that officially never existed? The hardest part isn't the memory of what we saw, it's the knowledge of what we didn't see. How many others were there? How long had they been using Fort Campbell as their territory? What happened to the soldiers who encountered them alone, without a partner to validate their experience? I've read about the concept of missing time in military records, cases where patrol units lost hours with no clear explanation. I've wondered how many of those incidents involved encounters that were too impossible to report, too career-threatening to acknowledge. Sometimes I think about going back to Fort Campbell, requesting a tour of the old facilities, seeing if the vehicle storage lot is still there, but I know I won't. Some doors, once closed, should remain that way. The truth is, I probably wouldn't believe my own story if I hadn't lived it. A rational person hearing this account would look for more plausible explanations. Mistaken identity, poor visibility, the power of suggestion in a stressful situation. They'd be right to question it, but they wouldn't be right to dismiss it. The world contains more than what appears in official reports and training manuals. There are realities that exist in the spaces between what we're taught and what we experience. Truths that can't be processed by institutional thinking. I was a good soldier. I followed orders, maintained my equipment, and served my country with honor. But I also learned that sometimes the most important truths are the ones that can never be officially acknowledged. The creature at Fort Campbell taught me that the darkness holds more than our flashlights can illuminate, and that some encounters change you in ways that last a lifetime. I am telling this story now because I'm old enough that my career concerns no longer matter, and because I think people deserve to know that the world is stranger and more dangerous than they might think. The truth has its own value, even when it can't be proven. Whether you believe me or not is up to you, but if you ever find yourself on a night patrol in unfamiliar territory, remember that some things are worth being afraid of. The truth is stranger than fiction, and some truths are too dangerous to ignore. If you've ever had to choose between truth and survival, you understand why some stories take 30 years to tell.